Tim asks, what would it take for the Green Party to get as much media coverage as Reform UK? Is it clearer, prioritised policy platform, a more charismatic leader, different media? Megan, you've been doing some reporting on this. Tell us about the Greens.
Yeah, so I met Zach Polanski, who is running to be the next leader of the Green Party. Currently, it's Carla Denyer and Adrian Ramsey are running on a co-leadership, but Polanski told me he'll be running on a single ticket. I think it's kind of all of those things. I think that the Green Party has been around for a very long time, but running on a single issue, especially when you've got Reform kind of running both on trying to make net zero into a culture war, kind of the next Brexit, and then taking on the immigration angle too. I think that the Green Party have kind of been a bit muddled, and I think that was seen in this year's local elections. I mean, they still did well by all accounts, but they didn't do as well as I think people expected in terms of, you know, now we're in this era of kind of five-party politics, and especially considering that Labour have been very much focusing on sort of looking to the Reform vote rather than kind of taking in the sort of more left angle, which is kind of where the Greens sit. I think Zach Polanski, who's running to be leader, obviously he hasn't won yet. His plan is to kind of be that more charismatic leader, sort of take the party back to sort of an eco-populism angle, which is what he has termed it, trying to take Reform on directly on some of these issues. I mean, one of the things he told me yesterday was that he's actually against the government's net zero policies, not in terms of, you know, he's against net zero, but he's against the way that in which this government is approaching it. He was sort of saying, you know, the battle should be taken to wealthier voters, kind of the 1%, you know, putting a wealth tax, like instituting a wealth tax, rather than kind of expecting less well off sort of your average voter to kind of do the work themselves, you know, sort of installing heat pumps and that kind of thing. I mean, I think that that's a compelling argument, but I don't necessarily know how well that will work out in policy. I suppose a wealth tax, it's a very popular idea. I think, you know, we've seen kind of the patriotic millionaires talking about it, Dale Vince, etc. But I think in practice, I don't know whether it would be a silver bullet for sort of fixing the climate crisis. I think there is some sort of a role for individuals there. But yeah, I think that that the Greens definitely have an opportunity now, considering that there is they've got a leadership election over the summer, and there are more local elections next year. I mean, we've spoken about Scotland. There's also Wales, to sort of take the opportunity to regroup, reassess, and kind of provide that sort of more of a challenge from the left.
One of the trends from the elections has been Labour really getting damaged by Reform, but not being damaged as much on their left by the Green Party as some in Labour had been concerned about. Are Labour pretty relaxed about the Greens? If so, are they right to be relaxed?
The Greens right now are polling 8%, 9%, around about that much. And to tell you the truth, they're already doing damage to Labour. The elections we just had were in English Shire counties where there was very little of a Green target against Labour. But where there were elections, so, you know, part of central Norwich, part of Lambeth, you know, the Greens were truly, you know, they were winning parts of the world that Labour were winning under Jeremy Corbyn quite convincingly about 10 years ago. And I put it to you now that 8% is enough to do serious damage to Labour. If there were elections in central Liverpool, the Greens will be winning central Liverpool wards. If there were elections in, you know, parts of urban London, and as there are next year, you're going to see some Green gains. And I put the polling position doesn't have to change much. It's already happening. Around about 10% of that Starmer base, those who backed Starmer last year, now say they would go Green. The damage is already happening. We're just not seeing it in these elections.
Ben, looking ahead to those Scottish elections, which are basically in exactly a year's time, what are you seeing in terms of an SNP resurgence?
Yeah, well, to answer the question, there isn't really much. There is a decline in SW1 terms, but in Scotland polling districts, no, there's no decline whatsoever. Look, in terms of polling, they have a double-digit lead over Labour. They're up 2 points on where they were in July 2024. In terms of decline, I wouldn't really say that. They are still, how long have they been in government in Holyrood? They've been in government since 2007. They're coming up to 18 years in office. And if an election was held now, if a Scottish parliamentary election was held now, they would still emerge as the largest party in Parliament. A pro-independence majority would still exist in that Parliament. The problem for them now, if we want to talk about decline, if we want to talk about, relative to where they used to be, they're now sharing voters with more and more parties. Reform, let's just rewind back to UKIP and Nigel Farage. They were seen as an English party, weren't they? And a great many Scots were very proud that UKIP never got anywhere close in Scotland. Now Reform are polling between 15 and 20%. And it's worth bearing in mind, 1 in 10 of those that voted SNP in 2021, in the last Holyrood election, now say they would go Reform. As many 1 in 10 yes voters, those that backed independence, now say they would go Reform. The SNP, voters are more than just one identity. They're more than that. They're a hell of a lot more complicated than that. And the SNP are sharing those voters around more. But, up against Labour, up against other parties, when first past the post is the order of the hour, they are still the largest party. So I wouldn't say decline, but they're in competition with more voters. And just to get back to the nub of it, Holyrood election next year, right now, if it was held, there would still be a pro-independence majority, i.e. SNP plus Green. And I don't think that changes the narrative that much. When you look at independence polls, it still is 51-49. It still is close. We haven't got away from that.
So in answer to the question then, possibly a reduction in the amount we're talking about the SNP, but not a reduction in their potential influence going into next year. And we'll be talking about them a lot more in the run-up to those elections. Our next question has come in from a YouTube viewer with, an unpronounceable username. They ask, do you think the power and responsibility that Reform gained in local councils will hurt their polling?
Obviously, Reform have taken control of 10 councils, which I think is better than better than I was expecting them to do. And I think that's quite significant because, they've come into local government on a platform of introducing, as Nigel Farage said, a Doge for every county. So that's sort of, the Elon Musk style Department of Governmental Efficiency. And essentially what that means is they want to cut so-called wasteful spending. So rainbow lanyards and net zero policies are very much out for the chop. When Reform get in, it will probably be quite clear to them that actually the amount of money that is spent in councils, that there's not really very much left to cut. A figure that's often thrown around is councils are spending sort of 80% of their budgets on social care, housing, another massive cost, especially in London and more urban areas, SEND. That coupled with the fact that they've said they will cut council tax every year when the government outlines their financial settlement for local government, it is assumes that for councils to receive the maximum amount of money, they will put council tax up at the maximum amount they're allowed to do without holding a referendum, which for larger authorities is 4.99% and smaller ones it's 2.99%. We're looking at a scenario where Reform get into local government, get into these councils with the intention of cutting taxes and cutting spending, but then finding that the things that they want to cut are very small. And actually that, with a lot of councils, demand is outstripping, the amount of money they've got to run services. So I think it will be very interesting to see what actually happens at some of these councils. I mean, what I haven't mentioned is that a lot of these Reform councillors have never been in a local authority before. I mean, Nigel Farage has certainly never been a councillor. So, yeah, I think for those with kind of a deep knowledge of local government, I'm sure a lot of kind of officers in these councils will just be looking and thinking, well, what are you going to cut? There's nothing left.
Yes, to quote Hamilton, as I often do on this podcast, winning was easy, young man, governing is harder. Ben, do you think there's a potential here for Reform, now that they're in control in various areas, to suffer in terms of their polling when it transpires that they don't actually have all the easy answers that they said they did? Or is that kind of part of their anti-establishment message?
It's a bit of wishful thinking, I think. I don't know if it will have much of an impact. Just on council tax, for a moment, just to follow up on Megan. Every opposition party likes to claim, they're putting up council tax. We wouldn't. We wouldn't, absolutely. Even locally, but in Chester, where I represent, the local Conservatives always say, we wouldn't put up council tax, but 97% of Tory councils put up council tax last year. And of those who didn't, they weren't responsible for SEND. For listeners who don't know SEND, that's special educational needs, adult social care. And that takes up 7 in 10 of most council budgets. It's absolutely a ridiculous occupation. So for reform to come in, saying we're going to cut the waste, we're going to cut all the politically correct translators. It's the rhetoric of the Tories in 2008, cutting the waste, cutting the bureaucrats, bonfire of the quangos. Nothing's changed in the arsenal of what they wheel out to the voters. It's just divorced from the reality of what's left to cut. So what impact is it going to have on the polling? I don't think that much, but I think it will have an impact on local campaigns. Where Reform have won, they've won county councils. 2-tier unitary authorities, and a lot of these councils, frankly, are not going to be around in the next decade or so because we are heading down the route of unitarisation, i.e. 1-tier authority. And you're going to be asking voters, are you feeling any effect of reform? And when it's 2-tier, it's hard to work out. I don't really think whatever they do is going to necessarily have an impact, which could be a plus for them, in that they can continue rallying against the system, but it could be a drawback as well, which is when opposition, now Labour, now the Tories, now the Greens, now the Lib Dems, when they ask voters, do you feel the benefits of reform? I think in a lot of places like Lancashire, Nottinghamshire and others, voters may say, no, I don't really think nothing's changed, actually. And just on UKIP, where they once ran a council, well, they've gone into coalition a few times, but they once ran Thanet District Council. They got a majority in 2015 off the backs of Nigel Farage's defeat when he stood for South Thanet. And that majority was cut away within the space of 2 years, not by elections, but by splits. But by a lot of splits, defections, the forming of independent groups, and half of that UKIP group became independent and then got into bed with the Tories. And within 2 years, Thanet District Council was back in the control of the Conservatives. I wonder whether we're going to be seeing that in the next few years.
So a history lesson there. One other thing that I would just bring up in terms of Reform's polling over the next couple of years, I've been speaking to figures in Reform who are aware of the risk that if the next general election becomes about Reform, about can Reform win or keeping Reform out, you may well start to see an anti-Reform coalition movement developing in the same way that in 2024 the message was anyone but the Tories. You might start to see an anyone but Reform campaign spring up if it looks like there's a very real chance of them becoming the largest party. Now, I don't know how much weight to put on that, because you would have to have people from other parties working out who the candidate most likely to beat Reform in their constituency was, and you can't really see that with the electoral landscape at the moment. But it is something that Reform figures are aware of, that if they become the main story of the next election, rather than the Labour government and all the way that people feel that it's let down voters, then that could be an issue for them too. And having lots of councils where you can point to the impact that Reform councillors have or haven't had may have an impact on that trend and that trajectory as well.